The blizzard came early that year. October hadn't even ended when the first white wall rolled down from the northern peaks and slammed into the valley like an avalanche of wind and ice. By midnight, horses were dying in the open. By morning, 2 cabins had collapsed under the weight of snow they'd never been designed to bear. Livestock froze where they stood. A boy from the Caldwell place was found with his hands black and brittle, half buried near the barn door he'd been trying to close when the wind slammed it open like a battering ram. In the aftermath, when the storm passed and the ranchers crawled from their damaged homes to take stock of what was left, one thing became clear. Only one house had come through without a single cracked beam or broken shutter. Only one chimney still smoked that next morning, steady and warm as ever, and it was the cabin they had all laughed at just a few months earlier. The one they'd called the fort, the bunker, the lunatic's lodge. The man who built it never claimed to be a genius. He didn't argue with the men who scoffed or smirked when they saw the strange angles, the thick walls, the buried base. He let them call him foolish, let them joke at the saloon about his overbuilt door hinges and his triple-sealed roofline. But he kept building, and when the snow fell, he stayed warm. When the winds came, he slept through them. And when the thaw arrived and half the valley had to rebuild, his cabin stood untouched. Not a single plank loose, not a single draft creeping in. What those men didn't know was that he hadn't built it just for comfort. He hadn't built it for pride. He had built it because he'd already buried a wife and 2 children, and he had sworn he'd never lose another to the cold. His name was Thomas Ellsworth. He arrived in the valley in the spring of 1882, a man with quiet eyes and calloused hands, pulling a cart too heavy for one man to drag, but doing it anyway. He came alone. No wife, no children, no cattle. Just the cart, a stack of books tied with leather cord, and a small chest marked with military brass. Most assumed he was another failed homesteader looking for a second chance, or worse, a man running from something. Nobody asked, not at first. They were too busy watching him drag that load up the old timber road and into the higher country east of the river. Land most men avoided because the soil was poor and the weather hit harder. But Thomas didn't seem concerned with crops or convenience. He was looking for something else entirely. He scouted for days, walked the hills alone, tapped stones with a hammer, measured sunlight with a plumb line and a piece of string. Finally, he settled on a ridge above a bend in the creek where wind cut fast, but water never pooled. From a distance, the place looked exposed, vulnerable. But Thomas saw something else. Drainage, and natural rock barriers, windbreaks, lines of sight, the bones of defense. He began building in May. Other men were branding calves, planting feed grain, digging wells. Thomas was hauling stone. He didn't just lay a foundation, he carved one. He chiseled into the hillside, cutting down nearly 4 feet before laying his first course of stone, locking it in with lime mortar, rare stuff for a homestead build, and thick pins of forged iron. Most cabins sat on dirt, maybe a few stones for the corners. Thomas's build looked more like a bank vault. They joked at first, the neighbors, called it the gold mine, laughed that maybe he was hiding something underground. Some said he'd been in the war. Maybe he'd gone mad from cannon fire. He'd sit on the ridge at dusk sometimes, just staring at the horizon like he expected something terrible to come walking out of it. But when they asked him about it, he'd just nod, smile faintly, and go back to work. The walls came next. Standard cabins use logs stripped rough and notched at the corners. Fast work, good enough to last a few years before rot set in. But Thomas wasn't interested in fast. He selected each tree with a surveyor's eye, choosing only lodgepole pine from a stand he'd marked a mile to the east. He felled them by hand, debarked them with a draw knife until the grain showed smooth and even, then stacked them using a technique no one recognized. No notching. Instead, the logs were pinned through with iron rods. Rods he'd brought in a separate shipment from Helena. The joints were staggered, the gaps filled not with moss or clay but with layers of wool, resin-soaked burlap, and powdered lime. Weatherproof, insect-proof, time-proof. By midsummer, rumors were flying that the cabin had 2 roofs, that the chimney was lined with brass, that he'd buried metal plates in the walls to stop bullets. None of that was true. Not exactly, but the truth was stranger than the rumors. Thomas had spent his last 5 years, after his family died and before he ever came west, studying buildings. Not just cabins. He had read military manuals, architectural treatises, papers from Arctic expeditions. He knew about radiant heat, knew about moisture wicking and thermal bridging and structural resonance under high winds. Most of all, He understood that the land would punish anything built lazy, so he didn't build lazy. The windows were recessed, triple glazed with glass he had ordered from back east, small, square, and few. The door was layered wood, 5 panels thick, hung with iron strap hinges that could support a wagon gate. The roof wasn't cedar shake like everyone else used. It was slate, hauled in from a quarry a full day's ride away. Took him weeks to bring it all in. But slate didn't burn, slate didn't rot, and Thomas had no intention of rebuilding once the first fire or storm came through. The men in town started to get annoyed. Some called him arrogant, said he was trying to show them up. One rancher, Sam Kirkwood, made a point of walking the length of the build one afternoon and laughing out loud. "Hell, Ellsworth," he said, "you build that thing any tighter, you'll suffocate in there. You waiting for the Comanche to ride through? Or are you just worried the squirrels'll try and rob you?" Thomas didn't answer. He was sealing the outer eaves at the time, brushing a thick black tar compound into every crevice. The wind blew hard on the ridge that day, hard enough that Kirkwood wrapped his coat tighter and shivered. But Thomas didn't seem to notice, didn't stop working. He just kept brushing. By September, the cabin was finished, and it didn't look like anything the valley had ever seen. Square, solid, low-slung with thick shoulders of stone and wood and slate. It didn't creak, it didn't sway, it just sat there, heavy as a sleeping giant, while the winds rolled past and the sun tracked low. Thomas moved in with only a cot, a stove, a crate of books, and a framed daguerreotype of a woman and 2 children. He hung that frame above the hearth and never spoke of it to anyone. Then winter came, and with it, the storm. It wasn't the worst on record, but it came early and hit fast, and that made it deadly. Most cabins weren't stocked yet. Wood piles were low, roofs not yet retarred from the summer's heat. The Caldwell place collapsed under drift weight. The Jennings chimney cracked and filled the house with smoke. Livestock died. Water froze. People huddled in corners, burning furniture when the cordwood ran out. But not Thomas. When the winds stopped, and the snow settled, and the sun broke through again, his chimney still smoked, his roof still stood. And when he opened his door and walked into the white hush of that morning, the snow fell off his eaves in clean, quiet sheets. Men stopped mocking him after that. Some asked questions, quiet ones, practical ones, about the way he pinned the logs, the materials he used in the chinking, about that stone foundation and the crawl space he'd dug. Thomas answered when asked, gave away his methods freely, told them what to do, what to avoid, how to seal heat inside and keep the rot out. He didn't gloat, didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't need to, because that winter was just the beginning. The next year brought fire, and the year after that, flood. And each time, one cabin stood while others faltered, and one man, once mocked, became the quiet center of something much larger. The fire came in August. It started somewhere near the upper ridge, where a lightning strike splintered an old pine and ignited a patch of dry underbrush. The wind was erratic that week, shifting direction without warning, and by the time anyone realized what had happened, the flames were already moving downslope. The valley had seen fires before, grass fires mostly, brief and fast, with smoke that choked the air but rarely reached the homes clustered near the creek. This time was different. The timber was dry, the summer had been brutal, and no one had cleared the upper ridge for decades. By the end of the first day, the sky had turned black. Panic spread faster than the flames. Some ranchers tried to dig breaks, but the soil was too dry and the tools too few. Others loaded wagons and herded cattle toward the far end of the valley, hoping the fire wouldn't jump the stream. But it did. Winds whipped it into a frenzy. Embers flew like hornets, shingles curled, dry grass ignited, and cabins that had stood for years went up in moments. People threw wet blankets over their roofs, hauled buckets from the creek, shouted orders that no one could hear over the roar of fire devouring wood and air and everything between. But for all their effort, for all their prayers, 4 more cabins were lost by midnight. Thomas Ellsworth didn't run, he didn't dig, he didn't pray. He closed his shutters, dampened his eaves, and stood watch with a bucket of sand near the stove and a blanket soaked in brine. When the fire reached his ridge, the flames licked the outer stones but never caught. The slate roof didn't burn. The walls, sealed with lime, repelled the heat. Embers bounced harmlessly off the heavy timbers. The air inside stayed clean. The smoke never breached the thick window seams. When it passed, when the black scar of burned earth fanned out below him like a wound, his cabin stood unscathed once again, and this time people couldn't ignore it. Kirkwood came first, hat in hand, smoke still on his coat. He didn't say sorry, just asked about the lime compound, asked if Thomas would mind showing him how he sealed the roofline. Thomas nodded once and led him around the structure in silence, pointing here and there, explaining the mixture, the layering. Kirkwood listened, took notes. He looked tired, looked beaten. His barn was gone, his cattle scattered. But in that moment there was something else in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or envy. Others followed. Jennings, Boyle, two brothers from over the ridge whose names Thomas never learned. They came with stories of heat and loss, and they came ready to listen. They measured his doorframe, tapped his foundation stones, asked about airflow, about venting, about how to keep smoke from backing up into the rafters. Thomas answered when asked, always concise, always calm. He even offered to help. When Jennings decided to rebuild, Thomas walked the lot with him, pointed out where to dig, where not to, told him how to position the hearth, how to calculate slope and runoff. He didn't ask for anything in return, but he never left his cabin for long, never spent the night away from it. And when the evenings grew long, and the air turned sharp, he always returned before dusk, locking the door behind him, lighting the lamp in the corner by the books, and sitting beside the heavy stove with the same book open on his knee and the same photograph above the hearth. It was a quiet routine, but one not born of peace. The truth, though no one knew it then, was that Thomas Ellsworth had built more than a house. He had built a promise, one forged not from plans or blueprints, but from grief. A long time ago, in another state, in another valley, the cold had taken everything from him, his wife Eleanor, his sons, Matthew and Julian. Influenza during a winter that overstayed its welcome and choked the town in frost for almost 3 months. Their cabin had been new, their neighbors kind, but the walls had been thin and the stove too small, and when the sickness came, there was no barrier strong enough to stop it. He buried them in frozen soil with hands blistered and bleeding from the cold. And when the thaw came, he didn't wait. He sold the land, packed what little he had left, and began the long road west. He didn't speak of them, not to the ranchers, not to the children who came up the ridge in summer to stare at the strange man in the fortress on the hill. But when he built with their memory in every stroke of the hammer, every fitted seam, every iron pin driven deep into hardwood. The cabin wasn't just shelter, it was refusal to ever let that kind of loss touch his life again. It was that conviction, quiet, unshakable, that made the structure endure, because he knew something most others had yet to learn, that nature didn't negotiate. It didn't care how long you'd lived in a place, didn't care how much you loved the land, or how strong your hands were. It only respected preparation, only yielded to those who met its fury with equal resolve. The flood came the next year. It started with snow, too much, too fast, followed by a spring thaw that hit like a hammer. The mountains shed their winter coats in a matter of days. Creeks swelled, the river broke its banks, fields turned to ponds, then to lakes, cabins built low, cabins without drainage, without foundation stone or proper pitch. They drowned, floorboards buckled, basements filled, mudslides crushed the back walls of structures too close to the hills. 3 families lost everything. One nearly lost a child. Thomas had built differently. He had dug channels, laid gravel beds, lined them with fitted stone. His foundation sat above grade by 3 feet on the downhill side, with a built-in trench around the perimeter. The crawl space beneath his floor remained dry. Water ran past him like he wasn't there. By now the jokes had stopped completely. People began to copy his methods outright. Jennings rebuilt with double wall construction and lime-chinked seams. The Boyle brothers raised their hearth off the outer wall and put it dead center in the living space. Kirkwood added a slate roof the next year. Children grew up thinking this was the way it had always been done, forgetting that only a few years earlier, the man who started it had been treated like a crank. But Thomas didn't mind. He didn't want credit, didn't want students or fame, or to become some kind of local legend. He just wanted people to stop dying from things that could be prevented. And he wanted his own quiet corner of the world to remain undisturbed. That quiet didn't last. In the winter of '86, strangers arrived, surveyors with polished boots and city-bought wool coats. They said they were working for the rail company. They wanted to run a line through the valley, open it up for freight and travel, bring growth, bring civilization. The valley folk were skeptical. The ranchers liked their quiet, but they also liked the idea of access, of selling cattle to markets further away. Some were tempted. Kirkwood signed on. Others began clearing land, marking trees with red paint. The surveyors approached Thomas, asked if he'd be willing to sell, said his ridge would make an excellent signal station or maintenance hub, that the elevation and wind exposure gave strategic advantage. He said no. They came back a week later, with papers this time, and numbers. He said no again. When they asked why, he walked them to the northern edge of his ridge, pointed to the stone marker embedded in the soil there. It bore 3 names and 3 dates. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The surveyors left. For a while it seemed that might be the end of it. But something shifted after that. Strangers began riding past more frequently. Fence lines were cut. Tools went missing from sheds. Someone tried to poison Kirkwood's well. There were rumors, whispers of intimidation, of accidents that weren't really accidents. And then, one night in March, A fire started on the south slope. Not a brush fire, not lightning. This was intentional, controlled. The wind was wrong that night. It blew west instead of north, and the fire never reached Thomas's cabin, but it had been meant to. When he came out the next morning and saw the burned ground, the charred remains of old cedar stumps, he said nothing, just studied the pattern, noted the ignition points, walked the lines where the fire had tried to climb. Then he went inside, closed the door, and for the first time since arriving in the valley, he began to make changes, not to the cabin, to the land around it. The ridge had always been defensible, even if no one had ever used that word for it. It sloped gradually on the eastern side, the path most travelers used to reach the cabin. But on the southern and western flanks, it dropped off in steep, rocky faces, natural choke points, the kind of terrain that forced approach into narrow spaces. When Thomas had first selected the location, he'd valued those features for drainage, for wind control, for the clear sightlines they offered. But now, as he stood near the edge of the singed grass where the fire had been set, he began to see the land differently. He didn't panic. He didn't ride into town to accuse anyone or demand justice. That wasn't his way. He simply began preparing for the next thing, whatever it might be, quietly, methodically, the way he had done everything. Since the day he arrived in the valley, the changes began at the base of the eastern path. He dug a ditch first, not wide but deep, a clean-cut furrow that followed the natural curve of the hill. Then he lined it with sharpened stakes, driven at an angle, spaced just wide enough to trip a horse or snap an ankle. Over that, he laid saplings and covered them with loose soil and leaves. It looked like part of the trail unless you knew where to step. Next came the embankments, earth pushed up into low berms on either side of the approach, reinforced with stone and planted with thick brush. From a distance, they looked like landscaping. From the cabin, they offered perfect concealment. Thomas planted thick stands of willow and juniper just beyond them, slow-growing, resilient, and perfect for obscuring movement behind the lines. He moved deliberately, spending each morning reinforcing the land and each afternoon tending to the cabin itself. He checked every seam, repacked every joint, oiled the hinges, and reinforced the lock bar with an iron crosspiece he forged himself in the stone hearth. He didn't have a forge, but he knew how to use heat, how to work metal with patient hands. He kept the shutters latched now, even in daylight, and he began carrying his rifle with him again, something he hadn't done in 2 years. The valley watched. They didn't speak of it much, but they saw. Jennings rode up once, tried to ask what was going on. Thomas just nodded toward the charred hill and said, "I build for the future, not just the weather." Jennings didn't press. Tension thickened across the valley as spring bled into summer. The rail company didn't go quiet. They bought Kirkwood's grazing land and began surveying further up the creek. They sent new men this time, not the polished ones in wool coats, but harder-eyed men with revolvers on their hips who made no pretense of surveying. They asked questions in town, asked about Thomas, where he'd come from, why he was here, if anyone had seen the inside of that fortress. A few spoke carelessly, said he was strange, sure, but not dangerous, said he'd saved Jennings's kids during the flood, that he helped with the rebuilding, that he didn't want trouble. Others weren't so kind. Kirkwood, embittered now, nursing a wounded pride and more debts than land, said Thomas was a loner, a military man maybe, a fellow with ghosts in his blood and something to hide. He told the men from the company that Thomas was the type who might burn his own house just to prove a point. They listened. They didn't act. Not yet. That summer was the hottest on record. Crops wilted before they matured. Grass turned brittle underfoot. The river shrank to a third of its size, exposing rocks no one had seen in decades. People went quiet, tempers frayed, and in the stillness Thomas continued to fortify. He began storing water in hidden cisterns dug into the hill behind his cabin, lined them with clay and stone, sealed with pitch, covered with false rock lids. Rainwater collection, enough to last a siege, if it came to that. He built a second door inside the first, recessed, iron-braced, locked from the inside with a sliding bar. He removed the floorboards in 2 corners and installed trap compartments, not to hide supplies, to hide himself if needed, and he modified the chimney. It had always been a masterpiece of heat retention, but now he added an emergency vent, something he could trigger from inside to dump heat and smoke rapidly, in case of fire or gas. No one noticed. No one but him would ever know how much had changed. Then came the night shots, late July. The valley was brittle with heat, and tempers had boiled. Around midnight, 2 cracks echoed across the ridge, rifle shots from the lower path. Thomas didn't flinch. He had been sitting at the table writing. He moved to the door, unlatched the top shutter, and peered through. Nothing. No movement. No second volley. Just the distant echo of hooves retreating down the trail. He didn't go after them. He didn't light a lamp. He waited, listened. When he was sure they were gone, he returned to the table, dipped his pen again, finished the line he'd been writing. Then he folded the page, placed it in the iron box with the others, and went to bed. The next morning, He checked the eastern slope, found the tracks. 2 riders, heavy-set horses, no attempt at cover. They had ridden in, fired shots high, probably above the roofline, then left, a message or a test. He reinforced the ridge path that afternoon, added a second layer of stakes, moved the loose soil, made the edge harder to spot. Then he set snares in the timberline beyond the main trail, not to catch animals. The next incident wasn't subtle. It came 2 weeks later, when Thomas was in town trading salt pork and lamp oil. He returned near dusk and found the main trail blocked. Someone had felled a tree across the narrow pass, an old pine, dry and sharp. It had been wedged intentionally, angled so that clearing it would take hours. He didn't stop. He cut through the brush, took the longer path along the southern edge, where the slope was steeper. He reached the cabin just as night fell. Nothing inside was touched, but someone had driven an iron spike into the doorframe. Not deep, just enough to leave a mark, a signature. He studied it for a long time, then removed it, placed it on the table inside. No anger in his eyes, just calculation. That week he finished the last of the traps, tripwires tied to small bells, hidden between trees, wound through underbrush. They wouldn't stop anyone, but they'd warn him, and then he waited. He didn't hide. He made trips to town as usual, talked to the few people who would speak to him, traded goods, bought tobacco and paper, but he said little, smiled less, and always he returned before dark. Then, in mid-August it happened. They came at night, 3 men, by the tracks. One stayed with the horses. The other 2 climbed the ridge, carrying something heavy between them. Oil maybe, a torch, no one ever knew for sure. But they stepped into the eastern trail without checking their footing. The first man hit the stake trap and screamed. The second stumbled back, caught the snare, went down hard. Bells rang. Thomas was already awake. By the time he reached the door with rifle in hand, the horses were already galloping away. One of the men on the trail dragged his partner down the hill, curses trailing like shadows. Thomas didn't fire. He didn't chase. He stood at the top of the trail and listened to them vanish into the darkness. The next morning, he dismantled the trap, packed the stakes, buried the snare wires. He knew it wasn't over, but he also knew something else. They wouldn't come back lightly. Word spread, quiet at first, just whispers, then louder, that the man on the ridge wasn't a hermit or a madman, that he knew things, could defend himself, that maybe the rumors were wrong, maybe the railroad had other plans, maybe people had picked the wrong side. The valley shifted again. Jennings came up one morning with 2 other men and offered to build a fence line around the southern slope. Just in case, he said. Thomas nodded. Even Kirkwood stopped by, eyes hard, jaw tight. He didn't apologize, just said, "You're not wrong about building for more than the weather." Thomas said nothing, because what came next would test all of them. And this time, it wouldn't be fire or flood or frost. It would be men. It began not with a bang, but with a letter, pinned to the door of the general store one morning, written in clean script on crisp paper, a kind not usually seen in the valley. The town's only schoolteacher read it aloud for those gathered around, her voice faltering only once when she reached the name at the bottom. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, but the message was clear. The rail company, after extensive surveying and legal acquisition, now considered all land east of the creek subject to easement enforcement. Any structures built without proper charter, including those outside the formal boundaries of town, were to be inspected and assessed within 30 days. Non-compliant structures would be subject to removal or forfeiture. There was no mention of Ellsworth by name. There didn't need to be. It was a line in the sand. The town buzzed for 2 days afterward. Some said the company had no legal standing. Others whispered that the governor himself was behind it, that deals had been made, maps redrawn, papers signed in distant offices by men who had never seen the land they now claimed to own. A few worried aloud about violence. Most stayed quiet, too quiet. Thomas made no move. He came into town once that week, bought flour, a new file for his draw knife, and 2 pounds of salt. He didn't mention the letter, didn't ask questions. When the storekeeper hesitated with the order, glancing nervously at the folded paper behind the counter, Thomas just nodded, paid in silver coin, and left. But something in him had changed. That night, he wrote long into the evening, not just in his journal, but on separate sheets, diagrams, inventory lists, notes on water storage, perishable rotation. He organized every item in the cabin, checked his ammunition, counted matches, marked every entrance and escape path on a hand-drawn map that he folded into the lining of his coat. He did not prepare for a siege. He prepared for abandonment, because deep down, he knew what was coming. The 30-day notice passed without action. Then another week. Some began to hope it had been a bluff, that the company had overstepped and lost its nerve. But Thomas knew better. He'd seen this kind of maneuver before. Calculated, strategic, pressure applied slowly until resistance collapsed under its own uncertainty. On the 38th day, they came. Not railroad men, not company agents. These were enforcers, 6 of them, armed and silent, riding horses fitted with black tack and no branding. Their coats were long, their hats wide. They came up the trail without speaking to anyone, turned onto the old timber road, and headed toward the ridge. Someone rode ahead to warn Thomas, but he was already outside, seated on the short stone wall he'd built years earlier, sharpening a blade with slow, even strokes. He looked up once as the dust cloud appeared on the trail, then returned to his work. When the horses reached the lower path, the riders dismounted. 4 began up the ridge. 2 remained behind, watching the valley with unreadable expressions. They didn't knock, didn't announce themselves, just walked up to the cabin, scanned the structure, and spread out. Thomas stood slowly, sheathed his knife. His rifle was not in sight, but it was close. He said nothing. One of the men stepped forward, clean-shaven, heavy-set, eyes like wet stone. "We're here to assess the premises," he said. His voice was flat, bored. Thomas said, "You've assessed it, now leave." Another man laughed softly from the side. "That how it's gonna be?" Thomas didn't move. "You have no papers? No authority? You're not lawman?" The lead man shrugged. "Don't need to be. Company owns this ridge now." Thomas shook his head once. "You'll find that's not true." Silence fell between them. Then the man took a step forward. It wasn't much, just a shift of weight, a flex of authority meant to unsettle. But Thomas didn't flinch, and something about that stillness made the man stop. Behind him, the others adjusted slightly, hands near belts, eyes narrowing. Thomas's voice was low, measured. "You'll leave now, or you'll bleed here." The air changed. For a moment it seemed violence would break like a match snapped in half. But the lead man hesitated. Not fear exactly, but calculation. He had seen that look before. In war, maybe, in a place where men didn't bluff. He stepped back. "We'll return," he said. "With paper, with men." Thomas nodded once. "You do that." They left without another word. By sundown, the valley knew, and everything shifted. No more neutrality, no more pretending. The railroad was making its move, and Ellsworth was standing in its path. Some wanted nothing to do with it. Jennings boarded his windows and moved his family further downriver. Others took sides quietly, passing word between fence posts and over late-night drinks at the saloon. Lines were being drawn in dust and blood. And Thomas, he began to disappear from town entirely. He spent his days on the ridge, reinforcing, not with traps this time, or walls, but with memory. He walked the perimeter, ran his hands over the stone seams, polished the stovepipe until it gleamed. He repacked his iron box, reorganized the small shelf of books, each action precise, intentional, because he had made a decision, not to fight, to survive. He wrote letters, sealed them in oilcloth, buried them beneath the hearthstone. He built a second stove vent in the crawl space, just large enough to breathe through if he had to hide below. He began sleeping on the floor, near the trapdoor, wrapped in wool and flannel with one ear always to the boards. And then, one cold night in early September, he heard the bells, not loud, just a faint jingle, carried on wind. He sat up instantly, pulled his coat on, crawled to the trapdoor and listened. 2 minutes later, the second bell rang, different position. He moved to the eastern shutter and cracked it open. Darkness, movement in the trees. He stayed low, waited. The knock came a full 15 minutes later. 3 quick raps, not hard. A pause, then a voice, familiar. "Thomas, it's Jennings." Thomas opened the door cautiously. Jennings stood alone, coat dusted with pine needles, eyes wide. "They're coming," he said. "Tomorrow, not company men, not hired guns, deputized contractors, 20 of them, from 3 counties, paper in hand. They're calling it a lawful seizure." Thomas's face was still. "And you? I'm telling you to leave." "I won't," Jennings nodded. "Didn't think so." He handed over a small pouch, bullets, wrapped in oiled cloth. "You'll need these." Thomas accepted it, said nothing. Jennings hesitated. "I wish you'd built something smaller, something you could walk away from." Thomas looked past him, at the moonlit ridge. "Then it wouldn't have meant anything." The next morning the valley awoke to smoke, not from fire, but from the chimney on the ridge, already burning hot. Thomas was ready. He had boiled water, packed provisions, placed satchels of sand near the windows, loaded his weapons. His boots were laced, his coat hung by the door. He wore his old military belt, though no insignia remained. The first men arrived just after dawn. They came in a tight column, 21 in all, riding hard and kicking dust. Jennings watched from the rise across the creek, binoculars in hand. Others joined him. Half the valley, it seemed, came to see what would happen. Some had wagers, some held their children's hands tightly and whispered about legend. The riders halted near the base of the trail. They fanned out, then began the ascent. No warning call, no offer of negotiation, just boots on the path, boots through brush. Thomas watched them come, not with rage, not with fear, but with the stillness of a man who had buried his past beneath stone and flame, and decided that his life, this life, was not something anyone would take from him again. The lead rider raised his hand, and the rest drew their weapons. The men came up the trail with the rhythm of professionals, boots falling in staggered cadence, rifles slung casually, but hands close to the triggers. They moved like they'd done this before, because they had. Not here maybe, but in mining towns and remote outposts where rights of way clashed with stubborn homesteaders, where law was a ledger entry and enforcement came at the muzzle of a gun. Thomas Ellsworth stood in the doorway as they approached. His coat was buttoned, collar up against the morning wind. The rifle rested beside the doorframe, but not in his hands. He didn't need to hold it, not yet. The lead man stepped forward, holding a document rolled in one fist, sealed with red wax. "You are in violation," he said loudly, projecting his voice toward the watching hills, more than the cabin itself, "of company charter, regional land grant, and newly assigned transit rights. This structure is to be vacated by sundown and dismantled within 72 hours. Any resistance will be recorded and responded to appropriately." Thomas didn't reply. The man unrolled the document with a flourish and stepped closer. "Per authorization code GR 1127B, signed and stamped." A single bell rang in the trees behind him. The man froze. Others did too. Some put hands on weapons. Thomas stepped forward once, just enough to cast his shadow across the cabin threshold. "You are not law," he said evenly. "You carry no warrant. That's a notarized company memo, not a court order. This land is deeded, recorded in Territorial Office, Charter number 376 Alpha, dated August 1882. You want this land? Bring a judge. Until then, step back." The lead man smiled slowly. "You're not gonna make this easy." Thomas didn't smile. "This cabin has outlasted fire, outlasted flood. It will outlast you." The moment stretched. Wind tugged at coat hems. In the distance, a hawk circled once and veered west. Then the leader nodded to his men. "Take the back." They moved fast, 4 splitting wide around the north slope, 3 fanning out to the rear wall. One moved toward the chimney, eyeing the upper stones. Another went low, scanning the foundation for weaknesses. They were assessing, not attacking, testing seams, looking for access points. Thomas stepped back into the doorway. Inside, the cabin was quiet. The fire was low in the hearth. A kettle of water steamed gently on the iron plate. His journal sat closed on the table, the photograph above the mantel steady in its frame. He turned once, took it all in, the shelves, the bedroll, the stacked stores near the wall. Then he walked to the hearth, opened a concealed compartment beneath the stove, and removed a leather pouch. Inside it were 2 items, a second set of deed papers and a sealed letter, addressed in precise script to a man in Helena. He placed both in the iron box and locked it. Outside, boots scraped against stone. Then came the first crash. A pry bar hit the rear shutter. Another man shouted, something about hinges. Thomas moved calmly to the side window, pulled the bolt, and slid it open just enough to see the shadows moving beyond the trees. He didn't fire, not yet, but the rifle was now in his hands, its barrel resting against the lower sill, his breath slow and even. One of the contractors tried the side door. It didn't budge. He called out, "We're giving you one chance." Thomas didn't reply. The man raised a boot and kicked hard. The door didn't move. Another kick, another. Then, frustration mounting, he called out again. "Last warning, Ellsworth." Inside the cabin, Thomas whispered, more to himself than to them, "That was your last warning." The first shot wasn't his. It came from the ridge, a crack of rifle fire, high and sharp, splitting the air like flint. One of the men behind the cabin yelped, fell back into the brush, clutching his thigh. Chaos erupted. Shouts, orders, scrambling boots, men retreating from windows. Another shot, this one striking the ground near the chimney. Thomas didn't know who had fired, but he didn't need to. The valley was watching, and at least one person had chosen a side. The contractors regrouped near the lower trail. 2 knelt by the wounded man, trying to stem the blood with torn cloth. The leader paced in tight circles, seething. "We're done playing," he muttered. One of his men said, "You want to call in the second group?" He nodded. "Tonight, we burn it." That night, the valley was still. Thomas didn't sleep. He sealed every window, stoked the fire, made tea he didn't drink. Then he sat by the shutter, rifle across his lap, and waited. The second group came at midnight. 4 riders, cloaked and masked, moving like ghosts through the timber. They didn't come up the trail. They came from the rear slope, climbing slowly, methodically, avoiding the traps now known to them. But Thomas wasn't watching the rear, because the real danger wasn't the masked men. It was the town going quiet, too quiet. No one had come to warn him this time. No lookout at the tree line, no signal shot. Something had shifted. He watched the masked men approach through a small slit in the shutter. One carried a sack, likely oil. Another had something wrapped in canvas. They moved in silence, communicating with hand signals. They reached the rear wall. 2 moved to the foundation. One began dousing the base. Thomas moved swiftly, silently. He opened the trapdoor, slid into the crawlspace and rolled to the rear seam. From there he could hear them, boots scraping stone, whispered curses. He reached into a concealed alcove and pulled free a small brass cylinder, an old war relic, a gas canister repurposed. He opened a valve, then he waited. When the fire starter struck his flint, the gas caught instantly. Not an explosion, just a roar, a column of blue flame that shot 6 feet skyward. The men screamed. One fell back, his coat alight. Another staggered into the brush, flailing. The others fled. Thomas rolled from the crawlspace and emerged through the front door, rifle in hand. He didn't fire, didn't need to. The flames were enough. They lit the night like a warning beacon, dancing up the wall and across the stones, flickering against the slate roof. But the cabin didn't burn. It had been built not to, and by dawn, only the blackened grass remained. Thomas stood watch until morning. Then he doused the remnants, buried the scorched rags, and walked the perimeter once more. That day, he saw Jennings waiting at the bottom of the trail. Thomas walked to him, said nothing. Jennings spoke first. "They'll be back," Thomas nodded. "I'll be ready." And he was, because the fight for the cabin wasn't over. It had just begun. For 3 days after the failed arson attempt, the valley held its breath. There were no riders on the road, no saloon chatter, no rail company men showing their faces in town. The general store stayed half empty during hours it once bustled. The blacksmith, who usually worked from sunrise to dusk, left his forge cold. Even the children seemed to know that something dangerous had settled over the valley, like a storm cloud with no wind behind it. Thomas Ellsworth remained on the ridge, eyes sharper than ever. He kept no fire burning by day, no lamp at night. His cabin, designed for defense and silence, became almost invisible against the hillside. Even the chimney stayed cold, the hearth now used only for heating water or warming tools in brief spurts before he smothered the coals again. Smoke drew eyes. Light drew worse. He didn't descend into town, didn't send word. He knew what came next. And when it came in broad daylight. It was the 12th day since the last assault. The men who rode into the valley weren't local. There were 7 of them. Not uniformed, not deputized, but equipped. Hard-faced men with weathered coats and deep scowls, riding lean horses fitted with saddlebags that clinked when they moved. A few wore revolvers at the hip. One carried a long-barreled rifle in a scabbard marked with brass inlays. They spoke to no one. They rode through town like it was already theirs, and when they turned toward the ridge, even the dogs went silent. Thomas was already waiting. He had seen them coming from the upper window, tracking dust through the dry air. Their posture told him everything. They weren't assessors. They weren't scouts. They were erasers, the kind of men you sent when you didn't want a second attempt. He closed the shutters, bolted them, pulled a set of leather gloves from the drawer and slid them on one finger at a time. Then he opened the chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were things no one in the valley had ever seen, not since the war. A 54 caliber Sharps rifle, wrapped in oiled cloth. A Navy Colt revolver, cleaned weekly despite never being fired since his arrival. A belt of cartridges, a box of spare caps, a pouch of lead balls so dense it looked like river stone. He laid them out with the care of a ritual. Not for show, not for threat, but because if this was the end of his time on the ridge, it would not come cheaply. Outside, the riders reached the tree line and dismounted. They fanned out again, 2 up the center, 2 flanking east and west, 3 remaining with the horses, setting up a perimeter that suggested experience, not bravado. One of them stepped forward and called out, "Thomas Ellsworth," the name echoed. "We are not representatives of the rail company. We are private contractors, employed to ensure compliance with industrial expansion rights." Thomas did not reply. "We are authorized to seize this structure by any means necessary." Still, silence. Then the man's tone shifted. "You are alone. You are surrounded. You will not survive resistance. Surrender now, and you will be allowed to leave with your life." Inside, Thomas loaded the Sharps. 1 round, measured, clean. He moved to the shutter slit he had widened weeks earlier, aligned the barrel through the dark seam, breathed once, twice, fired. The man who had spoken didn't finish his last word. He staggered backward, arms flailing, blood blooming from the center of his chest. He dropped before anyone realized the shot had even come, and then the hillside erupted in gunfire. They hadn't expected resistance like this. The Sharps rifle echoed like a cannon across the ridge, its heavy shot cracking limbs and splitting stone. Thomas moved between firing positions with the precision of someone who had practiced this 100 times. Because he had. He used the window slit, then the rooftop vent, then the crawlspace exit beneath the north wall, where he had a second firing blind camouflaged beneath broken brush. Each shot was measured, each one counted. The attackers scrambled, ducked behind rocks, returned fire blindly into the thick cabin walls. But nothing penetrated. The double-sealed structure absorbed bullets like they were raindrops. No window shattered, no board split. Inside, Thomas reloaded calmly. He didn't fire rapidly. He didn't waste rounds. Every movement was deliberate. Every step around the Interior had been rehearsed. The stashes of water, the sacks of sand, the bandages and tools. One of the attackers made it to the east side and tried to light a torch. Thomas shot the torch first, then the hand, then the man. By the time the sun began to lower behind the western peaks, 4 of the 7 lay motionless at different points across the slope. The remaining 3 had retreated to their horses and were riding hard back towards town. Thomas didn't pursue. He didn't even open the door. He waited until full dark, then moved out into the yard, rifle in hand, boots silent on the packed earth. He checked the bodies. None stirred. One groaned. He gave the man water, packed the wound, and left him there, alive but maimed. Let them remember. Let them see that he was not a killer by trade, but a survivor by design. When morning came, there was no attack, no riders, no smoke, just silence, and the valley, watching. It had changed. The next visitor came without a horse, on foot. Old man Carradine, the notary, hadn't climbed a hill in 5 years, but he came up slow, hat in hand, and stopped 10 yards from the cabin. Thomas opened the door and waited. Carradine said nothing at first. Then, "Word's gone out." Thomas nodded. "Helena sent word. They're reviewing the company's seizure process. Might take time, might not amount to much. But things are shifting. Folks are speaking your name differently now." Thomas stepped onto the porch. Carradine looked at the stone foundation, the scorched ground, the shuttered windows. "They called it a fortress," he said. Thomas didn't answer. Carradine's voice softened. "They were right. That afternoon, 3 boys from the lower valley carried a basket up to the ridge. Bread, cheese, a jug of milk. They didn't speak, just left it on the porch and ran. 2 days later, Jennings arrived with 4 other men. They offered to help rebuild the damage to the outer wall. "There's gonna be more coming," Jennings said. "Maybe not this week, maybe not this year, but they don't forget." Thomas nodded. "Neither do I." So they built, together. For the first time since Thomas Ellsworth had arrived in the valley, others put their hands to his walls. They helped rebuild the upper trail, reinforced the shutter latches, dug new drainage farther down the slope. Jennings even offered to help run a second stovepipe to vent more evenly in winter. But through it all, Thomas kept control of the structure's heart. No one else entered the cabin unless invited. No one touched the iron box. And no one questioned why, at night, he still locked the door from the inside with 3 separate bolts, because now they understood. He hadn't built the cabin to keep the cold out. He'd built it to keep the world from taking anything else from him ever again. When the ridge went quiet again, it stayed quiet for a long time. Thomas didn't take that for peace. He knew better. In his experience, silence after blood wasn't an end. It was a reloading, a gathering of hands behind closed doors. Men don't forget the sound of one of their own dropping in the dirt, not when they came with numbers and arrogance and still left without a prize. No, the fight wasn't over, but it had changed. It had cost them, which meant the next move would come differently. Paper maybe, courtrooms, or sabotage cloaked as progress. That was fine. He had plans for those things too, but something else happened first. People started coming, not just the ranchers who'd come to respect the cabin for its strength, or the families who'd once scoffed and now mimicked his design. No, these were strangers, travelers, homesteaders from over the pass, men from the dry counties east of the range, even a family that had been burned out 2 winters ago who'd heard about the house that couldn't be broken. They didn't come to squat. They came to learn, to ask, to see the thing with their own eyes. Some brought gifts, jars of preserves, sacks of seed. Some brought stories about companies choking valleys dry, about timberland swallowed up and rebranded, about cabins flattened by progress. They stood at the foot of the trail, sometimes in small groups, sometimes alone, and Thomas, for all his reserve, didn't turn them away. He would come down to the lower path, speak plainly, show them where the foundation changed grade for drainage, or how he'd layered the shutters with air gaps and lime sand infill. He showed them the thermal vents, the gravity-fed water lines, the slate seams sealed with tallow and beeswax. He never invited them inside, but they understood. This was his fortress. Not a curiosity, not a museum. Some stayed a while, camped at the edge of the timber, took notes, studied his methods like gospel. They weren't engineers. They were fathers, widows, men who'd watched a barn roof shear off in a storm or held a child through a cold night in a structure not meant for survival. They'd come to learn how to build against indifference, against nature, and against men like the ones who had come with rifles in the dark. Then came the first letter. This one arrived by mail carrier, folded neat, sealed with a territorial stamp. It was official-looking but not threatening. It informed Thomas that a new committee, formed under the Regional Expansion Bureau, was being assembled to investigate irregular seizure efforts by chartered rail interests. A request was made for testimony, for documents, for designs. He didn't answer, not because he refused, but because he knew what would follow. The next envelope came 2 weeks later, and this one bore the signature of the governor himself. Inside was a certificate, a land recognition deed, official and binding, affirming Thomas Ellsworth's full ownership of the ridge, the structure atop it, and the surrounding 10 acres. It named his boundaries, it cited his charter, and it carried a clause stating that the land was exempt from all future corporate easement under the revised Territorial Homestead Protection Act. Jennings brought it to him personally. He didn't knock, just waited at the trail's edge. When Thomas came down, Jennings handed it over. "Thought you'd want this in hand." Thomas took it, read it, folded it once. He said only, "I'll add it to the box." But Jennings didn't leave. "There's more," he said. Word spreading. Papers back east picked up the story. "Called you the man who built the unburnable cabin." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That what they're calling it?" Jennings nodded. "They're romanticizing it, making it into legend." Thomas looked back up the trail toward the low-slung roof and the squat walls of stone and timber. "It's not a legend," he said. "It's grief, with nails." Jennings didn't know how to answer that, so he left. And after that, Thomas kept his doors even more tightly shut, because something in him began to shift too. He had built the cabin out of mourning, out of a promise to ghosts. Every beam, every notch, every sealed joint had been part of that contract. A contract not with the land, but with memory. But the world around him was changing. The rail interest was slowing. Men who had mocked him were now building like him. Children in town played with blocks and called their square builds Ellsworth forts. He had never wanted attention, but attention had found him. Then, one morning in early spring, a wagon creaked up the trail. It was unusual. Most visitors came on foot, the climb too steep for wheels. But this one kept moving, slow and deliberate, horses straining. Thomas stood at the top of the ridge and waited. When the wagon finally cleared the rise, it stopped. A young woman climbed down, pale coat, heavy boots. She held a satchel close to her side. Behind her, a child peeked over the wagon's edge, maybe 6 or 7 years old, eyes large and dark. The woman raised a hand in greeting. "My name's Mary Weaver," she called. "This is my son, Eli." Thomas said nothing. She gestured toward the valley behind her. "We had a claim down in Willow Glen. Flood took it 2 years back. We've been drifting since. I read about this place in a paper passed along by a traveling trader." Thomas finally nodded. "That paper's made its rounds." Mary stepped forward carefully. "I'm not here to gawk. I want to learn. I've got hands. I've got skill. I want to build something that doesn't fail the way everything else has." Thomas looked down at the boy. Eli stared back, unblinking. "What does he know of building?" Mary's voice was firm. "Enough. He helped me stack stone in Bitterroot, cut timber with a bow saw in the upper pines. He's small, but he's strong, and he listens." Thomas looked between them, then pointed to a flat spot just below the trail curve. "You can camp there, 2 days. After that, we'll see." Mary nodded. Eli smiled, and so they stayed. For 2 days, Thomas didn't speak to them beyond necessity. But he watched the way Mary sharpened tools without being told, watched the boy sweep his mother's tent without being asked, watched the way they studied his work, not with idle eyes, but with purpose. On the 3rd day, he handed her a blueprint of sorts, hand-drawn, layered in ink and annotations, a hybrid of field sketch and architectural draft. "This is how I built it," he said. "Start with the drainage, then the slope of your roofline. Everything else comes after." Mary accepted the pages as if they were scripture, and with that, the ridge gained its first student. More followed. Not all stayed. Some just learned and left. But word began to spread. There was a man in the mountains who taught you how to build against wind and time and failure. A man whose home had stood against all threats, nature, company, and man alike. He never called it a school, but that's what it became. A place where knowledge was earned, not sold, where failure was dissected, not mocked, where a cabin wasn't just a house, it was a statement, a defiance. By the end of the summer, 4 new cabins had gone up in the lower hills. All followed his principles, all bore signs of the Ellsworth method: recessed windows, dual-layer walls, chimney mass centered in the floor plan. One of them even had a stone damper, an innovation that Mary had suggested and Thomas had approved with a single nod. It was not a school, it was a seed, and the man once mocked now had a legacy. By the time the snow fell that winter, Thomas Ellsworth's ridge no longer stood alone. Where once the cabin had been a solitary stronghold above the valley, now there were signs of life scattered across the hill's lower edge. Smoke from new chimneys curled upward each morning. The outlines of 3 new structures could be seen from the creek trail, each one distinct, yet unmistakably born from the same design language. Low roof pitch, broad eaves, stone-set foundations, recessed doors, slanted drainage culverts cutting into the slope like deliberate scars. They were not copies, they were evolutions, and Thomas had guided each one, not through sermons or blueprints, but by watching, correcting, adjusting. When Eli Weaver set the first corner post too shallow, Thomas showed him how frost would shift it and made him dig it again. When Mary tried to rush the lime mix for her exterior seal, he poured the batch out on the ground and told her to start over. No explanations unless asked. No patience for shortcuts. Just the quiet certainty of a man who had learned through loss and who now taught with the same severity that life had shown him. The cabin, his cabin, remained untouched, its shutters tight, the iron-barred door bolted each night with ritual precision. He still slept near the trapdoor, even as peace seemed to settle across the valley. And when people asked him if he'd ever leave the ridge, or sell the land now that it held value, or build another cabin for himself down where the winters were softer, his answer never changed. "This one's not built for comfort," he'd say. "It's built to remember." And yet, as the weeks wore on, and the cold deepened, something did shift inside that stone and timber fortress. It wasn't visible from the outside, but those who came close enough could feel it. There was warmth in the way Thomas lingered longer near the weaver's build, correcting Eli with gentler tones, even offering the boy his own hat one morning when a cold snap caught them mid-haul. There was a softness in how he returned Mary's borrowed tools, polished and oiled, with the handle rewrapped in leather scrap, and there was something in his eyes when he looked down from the ridge and saw fires burning in hearths he didn't build but helped make possible. He wasn't just holding the line anymore, he was passing it forward. Then one day, a letter arrived, again from Helena, again with the official stamp, but this time hand-delivered by a uniformed man who came on foot. He didn't come with orders. He didn't even ask to enter. He simply handed the envelope to Thomas, nodded respectfully, and turned back down the hill. Inside was an invitation, a formal request for Thomas Ellsworth to attend the Territorial Builders Forum the following spring, to speak, to share his methods, to help draft new homestead standards for expansion into the Northern Territories. It came with a voucher for rail travel, a stipend, even a hotel reservation. He burned it, not out of anger, but because it didn't matter. He had no interest in stages or forums or policies. His cabin already told his story. Every beam, every angle, every clever, storm-beaten, fireproof decision was his testimony, and it was enough. That night he sat beside the hearth and opened the iron box for the first time in months. He removed the old daguerreotype, the one of Eleanor, Matthew, and Julian. He set it on the mantel and stared at it for a long while. Then he stood, crossed the room, and unlatched the inner shutters. Outside, the moon bathed the ridge in pale light. From this angle, he could just make out the Weaver cabin down the hill. Smoke from their chimney rose steady, curling into the stars. Somewhere beyond it, faintly, came the sound of laughter. Eli's voice, high and sharp as he chased something in the snow. For the first time in years, Thomas smiled. And then he did something he hadn't done since the first storm, since before the fire, before the flood, before the attacks. He left the door unlocked, just for one night. The next morning, he rose early, as always, stoked the fire, boiled water. He set bread near the hearth to warm. He strapped on his coat, pulled on his gloves, and stepped outside. It was still snowing. Gentle flakes fell in soft spirals across the trail, but they didn't matter. The cabin had endured worse. He walked the perimeter as he always did, checked the stone joints, listened to the wind pushing against the walls. Nothing moved, nothing cracked. The roof held, the eaves held, the cabin stood. When he returned to the front steps, Mary was waiting. She held 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling from their rims. She handed one to him without a word. They stood in silence for a while, drinking as the wind swirled snow around their boots. Then she said, "I think Eli wants to build his own someday." Thomas looked down at the boy's boot prints in the snow, small but purposeful. "He will," he said. Mary glanced at the cabin behind them. "Think it'll still be standing when he's ready?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "It'll outlast all of us," and maybe it would. Because the cabin was more than timber and stone. It was memory made solid, grief turned into structure, discipline laid down in layers so thick that even time couldn't rot them. It was a man's refusal to let the world take everything, and it was now a beginning, not just an end. By spring, 3 more cabins had gone up. By summer, a trail was worn into the hillside by travelers coming to learn. By fall, children in towns far beyond the valley were building miniatures, block by block, of the cabin on the ridge, telling stories of the man who built a house so strong it laughed at fire and sneered at flood. And Thomas Ellsworth? He remained there, on his ridge, boots firm in the earth, door locked or not, eyes always watching the horizon, not with fear, but with quiet readiness, because the world would always send its storms. But his cabin had been built for all of them, and when he was gone, the walls would still stand, a monument not to defiance, but to endurance, to one man's simple promise, kept through fire, frost, and fury. This time, nothing breaks.